Welcome to episode 41 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. This month I was happy to have back a frequent guest, Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston. He is also a prolific author. His latest books are The Bittersweet Science, Racism, Racketeering, and the Political Economy of Boxing, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, and White Supremacy Confronted. In this episode, we talked about his book, Jazz and Justice, Racism and the Political Economy of the Music, published by Monthly Review Press. In this episode, Dr. Horne discussed jazz and justice, hip-hop, archives, DIY spaces, patriarchy, direct action, Charles Mingus, and current struggles. Thank you to Awareness for the Music, and here's a brief jingle by a fellow Channel Zero Network member.
From Embers is a show produced about anarchist ideas and practice across so-called Canada. Every week we spend about an hour going in-depth about ideas, histories, and ongoing struggles that we think are important. We're a part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. You can check it all out at fromembers.libsyn.com.
And I know you're a fan of Keith Sweat, so I don't want to get my questions twisted here.
No problem.
Okay, I got them up. So I wanted to start with Dr. Horne. You're from St. Louis, and your younger brother is a jazz musician. And I believe in your neighborhood, Joseph Bowie, trumpeter, and Lester Bowie, trombonist, were from your area. I was wondering if you could paint the picture of when jazz first entered your world and psyche.
Well, yeah. Growing up on Dryden Avenue in the 4100 block of North St. Louis, we were blessed to have as neighbors the Bowie family. The patriarch of the family was actually a music teacher. If I'm not mistaken, he taught music at Sumner High School, or may have been Stoneman High School. And he had these sons. Joseph, of course, played the trombone, and he was about the same age as my younger brother, Marvin, who played the guitar. And so, let's see, probably from about the time I was 12 or 13 years old, they had begun playing. And they, of course, were younger than I was. And then I shouldn't forget Byron Bowie, who was about my age. And then, of course, Lester Bowie is probably the most celebrated of the Bowie brothers, being a founder of the Art Ensemble of Chicago, and being world-renowned for his avant-garde compositions. However, I think it's probably fair to say, to respond to your question directly, I probably became aware of this music even before then, because my older brother, who played the clarinet, also collected albums. So I recall growing up listening to Horace Silver, for example, who listeners may know was a pianist. You may be familiar with his signature composition, Song for My Father, Cape Verdean Blues. Of course, his roots were in Cabo Verde, Cape Verde, as we say, off the western coast of Africa, now a part of the independent nation of Guinea-Bissau. And listeners may know that for decades now, there has been a sizable migration of Cape Verdeans to New England. There's a sizable Cape Verdean population in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, and Horace Silver comes out of that community. And so when you listen to his music, you not only hear the sounds and echoes of Black American music, you see the sounds and echoes of Cape Verdean music as well. And so to return to the thread, I probably became aware of this music from the albums that my older brother was collecting. And, of course, we were listening to these albums. And also, I should mention that on AM radio, there wasn't necessarily jazz on AM radio, but on a number of the black stations in St. Louis, and this may still be the case, I haven't visited there in a while, there were blues. Blues was played on a regular basis. And as I have suggested and others have suggested, blues basically are the taproot of jazz. Blues flows organically out of jazz. And as you know, blues music is this creation that stems from post-slavery Black America, with the lyrics oftentimes expressing the hopes, dreams, fears, tribulations, aspirations of the Black people themselves. And blues, of course, comes out of the South. St. Louis, even though it's in the Midwest, was a recipient of various streams of migration from the South. If you look at your map, you'll see that St. Louis is right on the Mississippi River, and due south is not only Memphis, which is another taproot of the blues, but also going further south to New Orleans, which oftentimes is given credit for being the home of this music we call jazz, which is developed in the late 19th century, it is said, as a result of the end of the U.S. Civil War. New Orleans, even though it was part of the Confederacy, had been captured by the Lincoln government forces early on during that conflict between 1861 and 1865. And there's this interesting tendency in the U.S. military, even to this very day. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, to this very day, the Pentagon, the U.S. military, your tax dollars probably spends as much or more on music and instruments and musicians as any other force in the United States. Now, I'm not sure if that's still the case, but it certainly was once the case. And certainly what happens in New Orleans in the 1860s is that there are military bands, and with evacuation of New Orleans after the Civil War ends, many of the instruments are left behind and flow into the hands of many of the newly freed enslaved, who then begin to create this music we call jazz, which, as you know, is dependent upon expertise, not least with regard to horns, trumpets, saxophones, trombones, French horns, bassoons, oboes, etc., or wind instruments, I should say, and strings, particularly the bass, but also the guitar. And then, of course, there's the anchor, which is the piano, or oftentimes the vibraphone. So that, along with the drums and the percussion, which predates New Orleans in the 1860s, you can trace the drums and the percussion all the way back to Africa. And in fact, you had anthropologists, including Melville Herstovitz, wrote this book some decades ago, The Myth of the Negro Past, where he sought to draw a connection between African culture in Africa and African culture in North America. And one of the, quote, survivals, unquote, of the Middle Passage was obviously the music and was obviously this use of percussive instruments. So there, in a nutshell, you can espy the roots of the blues, which then helps to create what is now this multi-billion-dollar industry of U.S. popular music, with offspring including various forms of rock music, various forms of what is called R&B or rhythm and blues, various forms of music that has taken the world by storm.
Thank you for laying out those threads so nicely, and I'm sure you include hip-hop in that genealogy as well, with groups like A Tribe Called Quest and Jasmine Taz and so many others.
Oh, sure, particularly with regard to percussion. I mean, it's the beat that's at the heart, the throbbing heart, if you like, of all of these musical forms that we're talking about. And there's this idea with regard to the origins of hip-hop, which you've mentioned, that in some ways hip-hop comes out of this genealogy that I've just laid out, but in a unique fashion. That is to say that with the onset of neoliberal policies, particularly the Reagan administration, beginning in 1980 in the United States, where there's an attack on government programs, there's an attack, to get to the point, on having music programs in high schools, for example. And so as a creative adaptation, you see that in places like the South Bronx, for example, in places like Los Angeles, for example, and other cities too numerous to mention, you see the youth react to having these musical instruments figuratively, if not literally, stripped from their hands by improvising with regard to beats, with regard to scales, or with regard to... I remember growing up in St. Louis, there was this phenomenon known as hambone. I don't know if people are still familiar with that. But basically, you created percussion by having your hand slap your calves, basically, to create percussion. And hambone, even though I don't think the term was used with regard to the rise of hip-hop, in some ways can be seen as a root of hip-hop, insofar as you had youth who refused to say or refused to accede to this decision that their music should be taken from their hands, as these instruments were taken from their hands, by creating these beats. And then, of course, that leads to what we call rapping, which I'm sure I don't have to explain to your audience what that is. Mm-hmm. And therein you see the flowering of another multi-billion-dollar industry.
Yeah, rest in peace to Biz Markie, too, on the news that just came out.
Yeah. I was singing his signature tune all night last night.
That's awesome. So more on the origins, the kind of you put out in the book as the Candelabra Thesis. In your book, Jazz and Justice, I really like how you, to quote you mentioned some other origins or beginnings of jazz. Quote, when enslaved Africans in Barbados in 1675 were launching a revolt, the signal for launching was to be sent by trumpet. And by 1688, authorities on this Caribbean island had declared illegal the using or keeping of drums, horns, or other loud instruments which may call together or give signal or notice to one another for their wicked designs and purposes. I was wondering if you had any comments on these ruminations and kind of this Candelabra Thesis.
Well, yes, that's the idea. Well, first of all, my friends in New Orleans get very upset when I try to suggest that other than the idea, as I just articulated a moment ago, that all of these musical tendencies flow from New Orleans in the way that I just described, with the end of the Civil War, military bands, etc. And there's another hypothesis that, which I call the Candelabra Thesis, which is that the music was developing simultaneously in different communities. I mean, for example, I think one of the reasons why we point to New Orleans as the sole legitimate source for the rise of this music, in some ways it has to do with the uniqueness and peculiarities of archiving. What I mean is that at Tulane University, early on, which is in New Orleans, some archivists had the bright idea to begin to collect oral histories, Black musicians in particular. And so if you look at the early chapters of my book, I'm quoting quite a bit from these oral histories collected of Black musicians, some of whom were born just after the Civil War, many of whom had come to maturity by the 1890s, for example. And that source, that rich protein source that these Tulane archivists had the foresight to create, has tipped the scales in favor of seeing New Orleans as the sole legitimate source for the flowering of this music. But if you had similarly inclined archivists in Memphis, for example, who had begun to collect oral histories from musicians, and of course, if you look at the history of musicians coming out of Memphis, there are quite a few, including the great Charles Lloyd, the saxophonist, who many people associate with California, because Forest Flower, one of the better-selling albums of these musicians we call jazz musicians of all time, if I'm not mistaken, it was recorded in California. And Charles Lloyd had sort of, if I may, a sort of California aspect. so to speak. And then Jimmy Lunkford. I mean, there's so many great musicians out of Memphis. And then you could say the same thing for St. Louis. Actually, you could say the same thing for New York, Chicago. We all know about Kansas City. And, you know, there's this sort of unique story about the rise of the music in Kansas City. And oftentimes the way it's told has a certain quirk to it. The way it's told is that about 105 years ago, in the aftermath and during World War I, which was 1914 to 1918, you had a crackdown on the red light district of New Orleans, Storyville. And many of the early musicians, black musicians who create jazz, have their roots in Storyville. And so with the crackdown, it's said that they begin to migrate, and they begin to migrate northward. So you would think that, okay, they're migrating northward. New Orleans is on the Mississippi River. St. Louis is on the Mississippi River. But Kansas City is 230 miles west of St. Louis. It's not along the Mississippi River. If you don't believe me, look at your map. And so then that raises questions about, well, how does this music migrate to Kansas City? Maybe there was a pre-existing tradition in Kansas City. So in any case, I think there's something to be said for this Candelabra Thesis. And I'm sure, as historians oftentimes say, that further and future research will help to bear out that thesis.
Thank you for explaining that. And in your footnote, I really like the story about saxophonist Charles Lloyd when you're speaking about indigenous roots of some jazz artists, about Sally Sunflower White Cloud, who was Charles Lloyd's great-grandmother, who refused to walk on the Trail of Tears when they took her land.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Trail of Tears, you may recall. Well, first of all, before I get to that, I should mention that I have a long footnote in this book, which is meant to tease future research and future researchers, because there's an extraordinary number of these musicians who are defined as black who have Native American roots. And, of course, this up to and including Jimi Hendrix, for example. And so I think we need further and future research on the ties between the indigenous population of North America and the African population. Now, of course, we know quite a bit, not in terms of the music, but we know quite a bit about their history. I mean, for example, in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, I talk about the close ties between the indigenous of Florida and the Africans, who basically merged. That is to say that they united to fight against the settlers and fought what in many ways was the longest war that the U.S. military has ever been involved in, Afghanistan today notwithstanding. That is to say, they fought the settlers and the U.S. government from the U.S. takeover of Florida circa 1820 up until the 1850s, when many of them were forced to evacuate en masse. Now, they evacuated en masse to southern Texas and northern Mexico. And you mentioned the Trail of Tears, which is an interesting story in and of itself. We associate the Trail of Tears with the so-called, as they were called, civilized tribes, quote unquote, which included the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, etc. And the Cherokees in particular had sought to assimilate into U.S. culture, up to and including converting to Christianity, adopting the dress of the settlers, creating an alphabet where they were publishing newspapers, which is still a major source for accounts of that time. And many of them were slave owners. They owned Africans. And so when you have the Trail of Tears, you had the U.S. government, particularly Andrew Jackson, who was a favorite president of the 45th U.S. President, Mr. Trump. In fact, he had this picture on his wall in the White House. You saw that Andrew Jackson said, you folks got to go, from Georgia in particular, but also from parts of Carolina, parts of Alabama. And they were supposed to go to Oklahoma, which was supposed to be the land of the Native Americans, for as long as the rivers shall flow and the grass shall grow. But alas, that was just one more promise not kept by the settler government. But in any case, many of the Cherokees and the other so-called civilized tribes had enslaved Africans in tow. And so you had an enslaved African population in Oklahoma beginning in the 1830s, 1840s. And that, I mean, that's a whole other story. I won't take up our time, which is supposed to be about talking about the music. We're talking about this story. But in any case, Charles Lloyd is just one of many of the musicians defined as black who can fairly be said to have a Native American bloodline, to use that phrase. And as I said, it really should be researched further.
Yeah, and like you said, these threads are also intersected, and yeah, thanks for bringing that together. On my next question, I kind of want to step back and see if you could talk about some of these autonomous or DIY spaces that jazz artists started up, such as the Clef Club in Harlem that James Reese Europe opened. And you write that it was a, quote, a combination gathering space for musicians, labor exchange, performance space, and a way to circumvent malign influence on the music. And I believe some musicians started a nightclub in the Canary Islands as well. And this book is a lot about the mob and racketeering as well.
Well, you know, a subtitle of this book includes the phrase, the political economy of the music. And so what I was trying to do in this book is tell a story about how early on these musicians were trying to claim more of the fruits of the labor that went into creating those fruits. In other words, even today, I'm sure you know, and I'm sure your audience knows, the political economy of the music is that the musicians and the artists create, but only a sliver of the musicians and artists are able to reap a significant percentage of the wealth that they have produced. I mean, actually, of course, that's the nature of capitalism. I'm sure that some of your listeners are saying, hello. I'm sure you, Professor Horne, you must realize that. Yes, I do. But in any case, I think it takes a particularly noxious turn with regard to this music because what happens is that these black musicians were creating so much wealth. They were relatively unique in that circumstance in terms of generating all of this wealth and then not being able to appropriate a decent percentage of that wealth. And so from early on, they were trying to organize clubs, as you mentioned in your question. They were trying to organize record companies. I spent quite a bit of time talking about the effort by the bassist Charles Mingus and the drummer Max Roach, beginning post-World War II, post-1945, to organize a record company, Debut Records. But it's very difficult to be a working musician on the one hand, and some of these working musicians, as you know, some of these folks practice 15 to 16 hours a day.
That was amazing.
So if you're practicing 15, 16 hours a day, I don't know how you find the time to organize a club or organize a record company, even if you have a staff. And then the other stumbling block is that it's not as if the vultures were willing to accept this competition lying down. As I say in the book, one of the interesting aspects of popular culture in the United States, not least the music business, is the infiltration, if not domination, by organized crime types. And these people are oftentimes thugs. I mean, I don't mean that in any positive sense, the way it has evolved today. I mean that they were willing to use their fists and guns to enforce their diktat. And indeed, I tell a story about 1920 St. Louis, where there was a battle royal between organized crime types on the one hand and the Ku Klux Klan on the other. At issue was that organized crime wanted to employ black musicians in clubs that they controlled, and the Ku Klux Klan objected on racist grounds. So they rumbled, and perhaps predictably, the organized crime faction prevailed. And so black musicians won the dubious right to be exploited as opposed to being excluded. And in microcosm, that sums up neatly the often desperate plight, not only of black musicians, but black people, whereas you're fighting to be exploited as opposed to being excluded. And obviously, both options are unattractive, to put it mildly, but I guess that being exploited means that you take a little money home, whereas being excluded means you take nothing home.
The horrific margins of continued white supremacy.
Oh, sure. And, it continues, as you know, to this very day. And it's interesting how this evolves as well. I told the story of Ahmet Ertegun, who was of Turkish descent. He was the son of a Turkish diplomat posted to Washington, D.C. in the 1930s, a Jim Crow town. Like many, young Ahmed was captivated by the music. But what happens is that there was Jim Crow in Washington, which meant that it was difficult to have black and white, to use those two categories, kick bajau in clubs. And so Ahmed begins to organize soirees at the Turkish embassy in Washington, D.C., where he would invite musicians, black musicians to play, and other musicians to play. And from that seed grows the mighty oak that is Atlantic Records, which I'm not sure if Atlantic Records, do you know if Atlantic Records is still around?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So that's the origin of Atlantic Records, by these sons of Turkish diplomats. Of course, they make a major fortune from Atlantic Records, and I can't say that Ahmet Ertegun was less exploitative than non-Turkish owners of music companies. And in any event, he became a kind of pillar of the U.S. establishment. He opened his commodious estate in Turkey to the likes of war criminal Henry Kissinger, for example. He was close to the Rockefellers. And so if this were a different kind of interview, I would have a digression about the construction of whiteness, the construction of white supremacy. Because interestingly enough, as I say in my book on the 16th century, the construction of whiteness comes out of religious conflicts, not only conflicts between Protestant versus Catholic, but also conflicts of Muslims, particularly Ottoman Turkey, which was the major power of the 1500s, versus Catholics. And in some ways, many of the European Christians unite under this new identity politics of race and whiteness, which makes it even more ironic that by the 20th century, you have this man of Turkish origin becoming a major progenitor of this black popular music.
Yeah, that does really digress and tie into your book, The Dawning of the Apocalypse.
That's right.
Definitely. Well, I'd like to talk about patriarchy and women in jazz, who are often overlooked and not highlighted enough. And I'm curious if you would share some stories of resistance from your research, and just to name some of the women jazz artists in your book that you speak about. I was going to name some as Vi Red, Mary Lou Williams, Cora Bryant, Dorothy Donegan, Betty Carter, Billie Holiday, Lena Horne, Dakota Staton, Myra Taylor, Shirley Horne, Marianne McPartland, Dinah Washington, Abby Lincoln, Annie Ross, Nancy Wilson, and much more in your book.
Well, for whatever reason, as you were reciting that litany, my mind got stuck on Mary Lou Williams, perhaps because she was such a talented musician and such a talented pianist. And she was also present at the creation of the Kansas City turn in the 1930s, which, of course, gives rise to Charles Yardbird Parker, whose roots are, in fact, in Kansas City, Kansas, as opposed to Kansas City, Missouri. And Mary Lou Williams and many of those other women artists and musicians you mentioned had particular difficulties. They had particular difficulties in terms of being accepted by not only fellow musicians, but also by critics. I quote one critic is suggesting that certain instruments should be barred from the hands of women because supposedly they were too dainty to deal with a big bass fiddle, for example. And then, as you know, even today, with regard to jazz musicians, a lot of the organizing of gigs, that is to say, employment opportunities, it's almost along the principle of a pickup basketball game. Whereas, for example, Chris Steele has the gig because he is a celebrated pianist. And this club in Denver wants him to play. And then Chris Steele then calls other musicians because this bassist friend, this drummer friend, this horn player. And so it's like a pickup basketball game to an extent. And so the women musicians oftentimes recounted stories of how if they had the gig and they're calling a male horn player, that they would encounter difficulties because perhaps the partner of the male horn player would get suspicious of this woman calling her, quote, man, unquote. And then, of course, we haven't even talked about the rather difficult road conditions, particularly early on in the 1920s and 1930s, where musicians are traveling from town to town, oftentimes on buses, for example. And, of course, there was a blanket Jim Crow that ensnared musicians of color across the board. But then there's a particular negative aspect that the women musicians have to endure, because oftentimes there's the question of boarding arrangements, sleeping arrangements, etc., that then opens up women to be harassed, sexually harassed, for example. So it's a very difficult climb for these women musicians, and that litany of musicians you recited, all of them had stories along the lines of what I've just articulated.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those stories and what you're saying about the women being too dainty to use an instrument reminds me of Bill Hooks was talking about when the computer first came out. These businessmen, CEOs said that their fingers were too big to use computers, and that only women would be able to use computers, which turned into quite a lie.
Well, yeah, what's interesting, even on Wall Street today, I mean, if you go back and look at the Wall Street Journal, you'll see that there's this claim that you'll have a fall in the stock market, a precipitous fall in the stock market because of what are called fat fingers. That is to say, some man, he meant to type this letter and he typed that letter or that numeral as opposed to this numeral, and the stock market goes haywire. Now, that story always struck me as being sort of an excuse probably for fraud and profiteering, but it's still reported in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. Matter of fact, we haven't had one of those fat finger stories in a long time, so pick up the Wall Street Journal this week, and don't be surprised if you read one.
We may be due for one.
Right, exactly.
My next question, I wanted to ask you about some examples of direct action you've seen with jazz artists. One, in your past works, you wrote about Bessie Smith and when she ran off the KKK. I love that story. In this book, there was a story about Rahsaan Roland Kirk and Lee Morgan interrupting the Merv Griffin show.
Right. Yeah. So the musicians, the artists, they reflect the times, just like hip-hop artists reflect the times, reflect the reaction to neoliberalism, for example, and the denuding of public schools, of high school bands, And the musicians reflect the times of the 1960s when there is this tumult, when there is the rise of what's called black militancy, and that's reflected in the lives of the musicians who stormed the stages of these productions in New York. You mentioned the Merv Griffin show. There are other talk shows that are produced in New York where they storm the stage because, interestingly enough, you have these house bands. Like, I'm sure you're familiar. Like, if you look at, Stephen Colbert, he has a house band led by John Baptiste, if I'm not mistaken, who has New Orleans roots. Questlove, out of Philadelphia, is part of a house band of one of the talk shows. But for the longest, these black musicians were excluded from being part of house bands. And so they decided to take direct action because these are good gigs. They're steady employment. It's probably the apex for the musician in terms of income, but they were generally excluded. They were excluded from the orchestras in Hollywood as well, from the studio orchestras, which were on contract to produce music scores. A person like Elmer Bernstein, who was an Oscar winner, who conducted created all these compositions for a score for music for a movie. Well, then there was Universal or Warner Brothers or MGM. They'd have a house band who would then play the music, but then the black musicians were excluded. So they had to take direct action, basically. And of course, you also had these unionizing efforts, and there hangs the tail, because since we're talking about Jim Crow, we're talking about U.S. apartheid, we're talking about so-called colored unions, and we're talking about so-called white unions. And as I try to explain, when the colored unions were liquidated, that was not necessarily a step forward, to put it mildly, for the black musicians, because with the so-called colored unions, they had a certain kind of autonomy that they could wield. But with the liquidation of the colored unions, they were then folded into the larger white unions, where oftentimes they had difficulty attaining leadership positions. They had difficulty having any say or any voice. And oftentimes the club owners would not want to hire them, would oftentimes hire a non-black musician who was not as competent or talented. And if you had a colored union, there was autonomy to protest, but once they were folded, once these black musicians were folded into the non-colored union, so to speak, they lost that autonomy. And oftentimes there was a kind of class collaboration between the leaders of the white unions and the owners of the clubs to exclude the black musicians. So it's a very complicated and torturous story, and one more strand in the fabric of the political economy of the music.
Thanks for breaking open those stories. To continue on with kind of artists reflecting the times, I was wondering if you had any stories on Charles Mingus and how he had the song Free Cell Block F, 'Tis Nazi USA. He had the song about Attica, Remember Rockefeller at Attica. I know he had a song dedicated to Emmett Till. And Mingus had said in an interview I was listening to that he said he kind of felt that he had no flag or no country.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. Not you mentioned Charles. Just a few days ago, his grandson, Kevin Mingus, called me. He lives, I think he said in Amsterdam, but he was visiting his grandparents in Texas. He had read my book, so he wanted to call me and said that it had inspired him to continue some research he was doing on his grandfather, Charles Mingus, who, of course, had roots in Nogales, along the border of Arizona and Sonora, Mexico, but grew up in Southern California in Los Angeles, and was not only a bassist, but, Mingus put out some very wonderful solo piano albums as well. And you mentioned some of his rather politicized song titles. Well, I work on this program on the Pacifica station in Los Angeles, KPFK, and one of our signature tunes is Haitian Fight Song.
Oh, yeah.
Mingus. And, of course, Fables of Faubus, is still worth listening to. It deals with the school desegregation crisis in Arkansas in 1957, where President Eisenhower, under international pressure, was forced to call in federal troops to patrol the hallways of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, to make sure that these 9 black students who were desegregating this high school were not mauled and subjected to mayhem. So Mingus wrote about that. And as I mentioned a moment ago, he was involved in Debut Records. He wrote a fascinating memoir, Beneath the Underdog. There's also a fascinating documentary film about Mingus, where I can't remember the title, but I'm sure you can find it through a few seconds on a keyboard. But there's a scene in this documentary which is quite revealing and sort of microcosmic in terms of the travails of black musicians, because the scene shows him being evicted from his New York residence. Somehow cameras were there and rolling. As he's objecting, they're taking his stuff out, putting it on the streets. It's quite poignant. And once again, it points up, and this allows me to mention something else that I should mention before our time expires, which is that because of these atrocious conditions that these black musicians faced in North America, quite frequently they went into exile. Charles Yardbird Parker spent a good deal of time in Europe. So did Miles Davis. Dexter Gordon spent time in Copenhagen. Once I said Copenhagen, I thought was the correct pronunciation. This critic corrected me, so that's how the German Nazis pronounced it. So what are you, a German Nazi? So Copenhagen. And Art Farmer went to Vienna. My brother, he spent a lot of time in Tokyo. Because, for the longest, there have been more jazz clubs in Tokyo than in New York. And, of course, you get a better welcome, to put it mildly, in Tokyo. And, in fact, I start the book by talking about this black musician in 1930 Shanghai who was about to be subjected to being roughhoused by these Euro-Americans. And he retaliates. And as he says, he's treated like a conquering hero by the Chinese, who apparently wanted to do the same thing from time to time. So what happens in the context of these musicians like Charles Mingus, who are these world-class artists and creators, but being treated like trash, as LeBron James once said, they take their talents and instead of going to South Beach, they wind up in, Yusef Lateef in Nigeria, Art Blakey in Japan, Miles Davis in Paris, Dexter Gordon in Copenhagen.
Thank you for sharing that. Going back to Mingus's song, Fables of Faubus, I love the lyrics of "Boo Nazi fascist supremacists, boo Ku Klux Klan with your Jim Crow plan." And then talking about artists having to go into exile, it really reminded me of a lot of intersections with The Bittersweet Science, your book about boxing.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, particularly with regard to organized crime. Organized crime plays a major role. These are the two avenues for black people generally, and black men in particular, who wanted to escape the mines, escape the custodial positions, escape the low-wage havens. Well, music and sports, particularly boxing, were the avenues. And the stumbling block in each was organized crime. And, of course, in the boxing book, I talk about these profiteers in boxing, who include the man I mentioned a moment or so ago, one Donald J. Trump, who has now bequeathed to us a phrase akin to Richard M. Nixon's phrase. Remember Richard M. Nixon, the U.S. president? During the height of the scandals, he says, "I am not a crook." And Trump has just been quoted after the tumult of January 6, 2021, saying, "I'm not into coups." But I think that both statements, both so-called denials, should be read as meaning the exact opposite of what is intended.
And along with that, and pondering up what you said about Mingus being evicted at the time is this whole story of not only mobsters getting put onto publishing rights or the dubious Joe Glaser. You point out how Gershwin stole music from U.B. Blake, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones mimicking black artists. Panama Francis, the drummer for Buddy Holly, you write about, said, listen to Elvis and how he copied Otis Blackwell note for note.
Well, yeah, and one of the most notorious cases involves the great Duke Ellington, the pianist, composer, conductor, orchestra leader, who was born in Washington, D.C. at the turn of the 20th century. And early on in his career, you had this guy named Irving Mills, who put his name on many of Duke Ellington's compositions. And so what that means today is that as the rights to this music becomes very valuable. I mean, you see how Bob Dylan just sold his catalog for millions and millions of dollars. And so certain Duke Ellington tunes, if someone wants to buy the rights, they have to go to the estate of Irving Mills, not the estate of Duke Ellington. I understand that's still a common occurrence, where these musicians, sometimes through naivete, sometimes because they're just overwhelmed and outmuscled by the other side, sign over all the rights to their creations. And once again, it's just another telltale story about the evolution and devolution of capitalism.
Yeah, and Irving Mills is the overarch villain of this book I saw going through it. And this is my last question. I want to be mindful of your time. You've mentioned that people for decades keep trying to bury jazz and declare it dead, but this declaration is a farce. I was wondering, what intersects do you see with newer jazz artists on the topic of jazz and justice, such as Terrace Martin, Robert Glasper, Kamasi Washington, Jason Moran, and others?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. Kamasi Washington, for example, out of Los Angeles, has gotten a lot of attention, justifiably and understandably, because he's not only a creative musician, but it's not easy keeping a band together, and he's been able to do that. And then if you look at Houston and Washington and New York and perhaps other cities, you have these high schools of the arts. It's a reversal in the sense of what I described from the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s, where you had a denuding of arts and music in high schools, to the point now where in recent years you've had the development of high schools that focus on the arts, and therein you begin to see the rise of this newer generation of musicians. And then you begin to see also, for example, the Thelonious Monk competition, which I think is headquartered in Washington, I might be mistaken, which has been the seedbed for the rising of many musicians of late. And then there's the old standby. You still have these musicians who make their mark abroad, and they establish a name overseas and then are able to translate that into notoriety here in the United States of America. But it's still an uphill climb. I mean, you still have these vulture-like piratical managers and club owners and record label owners, still have short-sighted critics who do not appreciate turns in the music. For example, I'm sure you're familiar with the kinds of brickbats Miles Davis was subjected to during the course of his career. Various critics who appreciate older styles of Miles but didn't like the newer styles of Miles. So the struggle continues.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Time Talks podcast. It's part of the Channel Zero Network. Please check out Dr. Horne's work and lectures online. His latest book is The Bittersweet Science. Thank you to Awareness for the music, and thank you for the support.